So once again, I want to welcome everybody to this ESRI webinar today. So the topic that's going to be presented upon today, I think you probably have seen a good amount of the coverage in the media already. But today my colleague Cathal Coffey is going to give a presentation on the impact of the COVID crisis on consumption and also on indirect taxes. So the way we're going to run things is Cathal is going to talk for about 20 minutes. We'll then take some questions, and the additional co-authors, Barra, Roantree, Conor O'Toole, Karina, Doorley, will all participate hopefully in the question and answer session as well. So the way to submit questions is through the Q&A function. If you just hover the cursor over the screen, you'll see Q&A comes up. And the questions will be fed through to me, and I will do my best then to try and get a nice range of questions and to sort of synthesize what's been asked. So I think that's all I need to say for now. So with that, we'll hand over to Cathal, and I think Cathal, you'll share your screen and then go through the slides for about 20 minutes.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Alan. I'm just going to share my screen here now, and we'll get the slideshow going. And we'll go to full screen. Okay. So first of all, I'd just like to say my name is Cathal Coffey. I'm a research assistant in the ESRI, and I work on the housing and macro team under Conor O'Toole. I'd like to say thanks to everybody for tuning in, and thanks to Alan for giving us his time today. I know he's very busy, so thanks for dropping in. So this project is the third. This paper is the third in a series of budget perspective papers. And this paper is a collaboration between ourselves on the housing and macro team and the tax, welfare and pensions team, from whom we have Karina, Doorley and Barra, Roantree. So the title of this paper is The Effect of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Consumption and Indirect Tax in Ireland. And this is very important because not only is indirect tax a very large source of revenue for the state, but also how consumption evolves throughout the rest of the year will have an impact on businesses, and from there, I suppose, an impact on the labour market as well. So it's very important to look into this. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and I'll take you through the slides, and then we'll move on to some questions and answers. So a brief overview of our paper. So overall, what we're trying to do is assess the potential effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on household spending and indirect tax revenues. So to do this, we use a household budget survey. This contains info on household characteristics, income, and their weekly spending. The most recent one available to us is the 2015-16 household budget survey, and that's carried out between February 15 and February 2016. So we do this across 3 scenarios for 2020. So we have a baseline scenario called new normal. We have our second scenario, which is what we call severe, and it's where a second wave emerges. And we have a benign scenario where a vaccine allows us to return to normal consumption. So roughly our 3 scenarios are the same up until the end of Q3, and they broadly follow the government's plan for the roadmap to reopening the economy. In the 4th quarter of each year is where our scenarios differ. Under new normal, we have ongoing social distancing. So some businesses like pubs and restaurants will still be at reduced capacity. And our second wave, we go back to a 12-week lockdown as a result of increased viral transmission or something like that. And then our benign scenario is where something like a vaccine allows us to return to completely normal consumption in the final quarter of the year. So this next slide here, before we go into what happens to consumption and what happens to indirect taxes, I just want to show you what spending looks like. So these are proportions or percentages of overall aggregate expenditure broken down across some items. And we've grouped those items into 3 groups. So we have essentials in green, restricted in red, and then other. Essentials are quite literally the bare essentials. So we've got some housing costs, we've got groceries, fuel and light, and medical. In restricted, in red, we have things that will be impacted by the lockdown. So things like transport, drink in pubs, meals outside of the home, holidays, durable goods there as well. So that's things like your washing machine and your fridge. And then we have other. Across the top there, the slender bars across the top of this graphic, you can see there that essentials correspond to about 38% of the overall spending. Restricted about 36%, and other about 25 or 6%. And below that, then you can see them itemized and broken down. So you can see there that housing cost is a substantial, it's the majority of essentials, and it's 20% of the total spending on its own. Another big one there is transport at 14.9%, 15%. And so that's roughly a nice picture there that shows you what spending looks like overall. But when we break this down, these shares of essential, restricted, and other across the income distribution, and that's what we've done here, you can see that they vary. So you can see that the lowest, so these are the quintiles of the disposable income distribution. So the 20%, the lowest 20% of households in terms of their disposable income distribution, you can see are spending just under 50%, but 48% of their total spending is on things that we've classed as essential. And you can see as you move up the income distribution, that share falls. And so needless to say, the more you spend on essentials, the more vulnerable you are to a hit in terms of your income. And so that's why the labour market, what's happening in the labour market is very important as well. And I'll say a little bit about that at the end. So essentials also, the more you spend on essentials, the less scope you have to reduce your spending. And so in terms of the things that are restricted, as we move up the income distribution, those restricted things are the things that will disappear during the lockdown, but they're also the areas where you're likely to see a little bit of a rebound where people are able to spend again. And just before I move on from this slide, I just wanted to note there that the spending on essentials makes up a larger share of expenditure for low income households, as I've said, but also for single and for renting households when they're compared to others. So I'll just briefly take you through our methodology now. So the first step we did was to update the household budget survey data to 2019. Then we split 2020 into different periods, and I'll explain that in a second. And from that, then we generate a set of parameters for each of these type of periods. And what I mean by parameter, a parameter is a scalar or a number that we're going to use to adjust the spending on an item from the household budget survey from its normal level to its new level. And by new level, I mean its level in one of these periods. Combining those, we generate a new level of consumption expenditure for each of our three scenarios. And then from there, we estimate the indirect tax paid in each of these scenarios using ITSIM, which is a tool developed by the researchers in the ESRI in partnership with the Department of Finance to examine exactly that, indirect taxes based on the household budget survey. So here's our scenarios. And you can see here in this table that it kind of explains where they're similar and where they differ. So the dates there are, well, first of all, you can see that all of our three scenarios are the same up until the end of Q3. The phases are dated in accordance with the government's plan, as it is at the minute. And so you can see that January and February we've classed as kind of normal periods. March we parameterized as it's on its own, based on data for the entire month of March from stuff like the CSO's retail sales indices and Central Bank of Ireland card spending data. So when we get down to Q4, this is where our scenarios differ. So in our new normal, we have ongoing social distancing right up until the end of the year. Under our second wave scenario, the most severe, we go back into 12 weeks of lockdown. And under our vaccine scenario, we go back to normal economic activity in Q4. And that's the same sort of activity that we would have seen in January and February. So our parameters. So for each item in the household budget survey, we map out a 2020 consumption path by generating a parameter for each item for each period. So for normal consumption, we've assumed that it's the same as the 2019 level. For March, we parameterize March itself by mapping changes that we witnessed in the CSO retail sales indices and the Central Bank of Ireland's credit and debit card spending data, the spending categories within the household budget survey. We also looked at stuff like Ryanair data. We went to the Society of the Irish Motoring Industry for some of the transport expenditure stuff. And we also got in touch with the Restaurants Association of Ireland. So for the lockdown and the phases, our approach was to restrict spending on items where providers were closed during the lockdown, and then we gradually activate them or increase them based on the contents of the roadmap to reopening. And so just a little description then on what we've called new normal. So we reduce or increase spending in given categories that are likely to be impacted by the continuation of social distancing. And so an example of that is we've elevated spending on detergents and stuff like that for the remainder of 2020 under new normal, but we've cut spending on things like international air travel. So here are the main results. So we simulate spending will fall by between 12 and 20% in terms of household consumption expenditure in 2020 relative to 2019. And so you can see there under our new normal scenario, we'll be down 13%. Under our second wave scenario, the most severe, will be down 20%. And under our vaccine scenario, where even in for the full Q4 of the year, we're able to return to normal spending, we're still going to be down about 12% in terms of household expenditure. This is a little bit more informative, where we've broken it down across the different spending categories for each of our scenarios. And so you can see here, these are the percentage changes from 2019 to 2020 based on spending. And you can see that transport and durables and clothing and footwear are the most heavily impacted in all the scenarios. And it's quite severe there in our severe scenario, just under 60% for transport there, reduction in the severe scenario. The non-durables there, where you see a little increase under 10%, that corresponds to things, so non-durables would be your toilet paper, your disinfectants, your detergents. So that explains that slight increase there. Light and fuel, you'll see nothing across from, and that's because we've held light and fuel constant across all scenarios, across all periods. Food there has a slight decrease, and that's because the category food contains both food at home and food outside of home. So we have seen an increase in food at home, but food outside of the home is what's resulting in that overall decrease there. So the next step then was to see the impact of all this on the indirect taxes, the indirect tax take. And indirect taxes are stuff like VAT, carbon tax, and things like that. So this graph here shows our estimate of the average indirect tax paid per household in each of our periods. So in our normal period there, you can see it's estimated to be about 110 euros a week. So for March then, we've seen a slight reduction in that. And then we've moved on to shutdown, and you can see quite a dramatic fall there. And that's because a large portion of indirect tax revenue comes from areas of household spending that are most affected by the lockdown. So transport is a great example. Spending on transport in general can be subject to things like fuel duty, VAT, and carbon tax. So a cut there in terms of spending will have a large impact on the indirect tax take. And then you can see as you move from phase 1 to phase 5 and into new normal, you can see that the VAT gradually recovers throughout the year as people have more opportunity to spend their money. And we're still, even in our new normal scenario, we're not quite back to where we were, but we're not too far off either. So in terms of the year overall, this is the percentage change relative to the 2019 level in terms of the aggregate indirect tax take. So under our new normal scenario, we're looking at being down 20.5% when compared to 2019. Under our second wave, quite severe, at almost 32% lower indirect tax take in 2020 compared to 2019. And under our vaccine scenario, again, even with Q4 fully back to normal consumption, we're still down just under 19%. Now, so this next graph, I bring everything back together. So in the color graphs, you'll still see the fall in the indirect tax take between 2019 and 2020. In gray, you'll see the fall in consumption spending that we've brought back in for each of our scenarios. And then in bold, in black, you'll see what that percentage fall in indirect tax looks like in monetary terms. So I'll take you through the scenarios. So under new normal, a 13% fall in consumption expenditure will correspond to a 20.5% fall in indirect taxes. And in monetary terms, that is about 4.3 billion. And that's based on the Department of Finance published a figure where they said the indirect tax take for 2019 was about 21.1 billion. And so applying our percentages to that, that is the result. So under the second wave, we have a 20% fall in consumption. That corresponds to a 31.7% fall in the indirect tax take. And in monetary terms, that's a fall of 6.7 billion euro. And under our vaccine scenario, again, a consumption fall of about 12%. That'll correspond to a fall in indirect taxes of about 18.7%. And in monetary terms, that's 3.9 billion euro. So I'll just draw a few conclusions before we hand back over to the panel for some questions and answers. So in that graph in that slide where I showed you spending on essentials broken down across the income distribution, we've seen that essentials make up a larger share of total spending for lower income, single and renting households. So it's difficult for these people to weather an income shock. The more money you're spending on essentials, the more vulnerable you are to a hit to your income. And recent work by the Tax, Welfare and Pensions team there showed that the pandemic unemployment payment and the temporary wage subsidy scheme were especially important for these groups in terms of cushioning them from a hard fall in their income. So particular attention should be given to this when these schemes are being redesigned. And again, just to go back over some of the main results. So under our new normal scenario, a 13% fall in spending would lead to a 20.5% fall in indirect taxes, according to our simulation. Under the second wave, a 20% fall in spending could result in a 31.7% fall in indirect taxes. And under the vaccine scenario, a 12% fall could result in spending, could result in an 18.7% fall in the indirect tax take. And also, just to say, some of this might be a little optimistic insofar as if there is an increase in viral transmission during the roadmap, people might not consume as we think. They might change their behavior. Our scenarios assume that they follow the spending, that they follow a strict spending pattern essentially up until the end of phase 5. But if viral transmission is breaking out before that, you might see a behavioral change where people cut back in spending themselves. And so, for example, in our second wave there, that 31.7 might be a little optimistic. So I'm now going to hand back over to Alan to manage the questions and answers. And I'd like to say thanks very much for listening.
Great, thanks so much for that, Cathal. Really good presentation. So congratulations. I know it's a strange and difficult thing to do, presenting through this format, but well done for doing such a good job. So I'm going to invite people to provide questions by using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens. But before getting into taking the questions, and people can start putting them in, I'm going to ask a few of my own. And I'm going to ask 3, and I know we've got the range of panelists, so they can pitch in as needed. These are pretty straightforward questions, actually. So the first is, I was just curious to know what assumption has been employed on the wind back of the PUP payments. Okay, so clearly a lot of discussion about when these things are going to be tapered or withdrawn, or whatever the phrase is. So just want to know, because I presume that interacts with the consumption numbers. The second thing, I was just curious to know on the specifics of alcohol expenditure. I don't know. I've heard sort of varying reports on this. I don't know if alcohol expenditure is up or down or whatever like that. But to the extent that that's tax intensive, just interested on the specifics of that. And then my third point is in regard to transport. And I think one of the things I'm interested here is we've known even before this event that where the government sort of policies on things like EVs and a range of other things to be successful, the implication would have been that a lot of the tax revenue that comes through transport should have diminished. So we almost have this natural experiment now where we're turning off a lot of sort of private car demand in particular. And I'm just wondering, have you looked specifically at the impact on revenues from transport and what that might tell us about revenue losses in a situation where we're being quite successful in terms of moving along the green agenda. So there's three questions there. I've been told I'm to look for raised hands amongst the panelists to see who wants to. So Barra, you're tentatively raising your hands, which means you want to pitch in. So you take whichever, and then we can rotate back on the other panelists as needed.
Sure, thanks, Alan. So just on the final one of those about the indirect taxes related to motoring. So we know that there's a large proportion of tax revenue comes from activities related to motoring, be it the buying of cars, the registering of cars, the purchasing of fuel. And in the long run, most of those are dependent to an extent on how much a car emits. So, you know, for a lot is raised in fuel duty. As cars move towards electricity, there's not going to be fuel duty collected from that. Likewise, the amount of VRT that's charged on the car and the amount of motor tax each year depends on the emissions band of the car. So we have a long-term structural issue there. And as you say, we're essentially getting a foretaste of what's to come in that people are stopping to driving. And so that's a large chunk of revenues there. But that's going to get even more severe in the years ahead. And that's, I think, why it's something that's quite important that we're going to need to look at what other taxes to replace that revenue. So there's several billion in tax revenue which will be foregone, and you know, if people don't go back to driving as much as they did, maybe there's less commuting, we're going to get essentially that accelerate over the next few years. So there really is going to be need to look at, even if the economy did rebound back to its level, the composition of expenditure is going to change, and so we're going to need to look for replacement taxes for some of that revenue which has disappeared. And things like congestion charges are the natural type of replacement for that, in that they target the activity for motoring that's actually probably imposes the most costs on others, most externalities. That's probably the most costly thing related to motoring. Isn't actually its costs in terms of the climate change. Those emissions are reasonably well priced, not as well as they could be, but it really is in terms of congestion that is where the largest cost has been. And so we're going to need to look at other things like that, and we might need to look at them sooner than we otherwise would have.
Okay, anybody else want to pitch in? Karina?
I'll come in on the pandemic unemployment payment. So I guess what we've learned from both this piece of research and previous research we did on the cost and distributional effect of employment losses due to the pandemic is that the pandemic unemployment payment does a really good job of cushioning the incomes of the lowest half of the income distribution and sheltering them from the unemployment shock due to the pandemic. And what we now know as well is that that kind of half of the income distribution, they are also the groups of people who spend most of their money on essential items, things like groceries and rent and things like that. So I guess the lesson here is that thought will need to be given to how to withdraw the pandemic unemployment payment in such a way that these people will still have enough money to make ends meet. So consideration might need to be given to things like further rent supports, because these people are also more likely to be renting than to be living in owner-occupied housing. So it's just another consideration in withdrawing the pandemic unemployment payment, which will eventually have to be withdrawn, but how to do that in order to make sure that this group of people at the bottom of the income distribution who do spend most of their household budget on essentials are still able to do so.
Okay, thanks for that. So question, Conor, you want to make a contribution before we go to the next question?
Well, I was going to just pick up on your final comment, which is on the alcohol expenditure. I've been left with the bar stool seat here. So, you know, it's very clear when you look at retail sales data that expenditure on bars dramatically dropped. It halved in March, and that was before the very severe restrictions came in towards the end of March. And what we have done in most of the scenarios, just going to give a little bit of insight into how we parameterize them, was that particularly in the new normal, we didn't let bars nearly recover anywhere past half capacity towards the end of the year if they're trying to operate with physical distancing type restrictions in terms of their operations. So it would be only in the vaccine type disease suppression scenario that they would get back to a situation where they would be in the pre-COVID world, you know, their normal consumption levels. So that item in particular is well down in the scenarios we've put together.
Okay, so there's a question here provided by Ray Lydon from the Central Bank. I presume Ray won't mind me attaching his name to this question, but I think the context is important because he does put it in terms, he's asking the question as a central banker. So there's a couple of strands to this. The first is what has been assumed about price levels. which is an interesting dimension, which I have to confess I hadn't thought about. And the other is the question of precautionary savings, okay, as to how these are being treated. And I know John Fitzgerald has been writing about this, and it is actually an interesting one. But I mean, could it be the case? I suppose there's two possibilities here, that precautionary savings will stay elevated, or could there be a significant consumption rebound when you know, the restrictions are being eased? So I'm looking across the group as to who might want to take. Karina, you're going to be brave, and then I'll come to you, Conor, on that.
I'll start off, and I'm sure the others can interject as well. So what we've done for price levels here is we've uprated spending in the household budget survey from 2015, 2016 to 2019 levels using CPI indices. We've assumed no growth in price levels between 2019 and 2020, basically in the absence of any good data to tell us whether they're going up or down, or what the correct assumption is for the whole of 2020. So prices are fixed at 2019 levels in our analysis. Precautionary savings, so that is something, so the kind of traffic light graph that Cathal showed, where, and the follow-up graph, which showed that higher income households spend a larger proportion of their budget on restricted items, does suggest that there will be extra savings made by these groups of households, purely because they can't spend their budget on things that they would normally spend them on. So there is a possibility that there will be extra savings for higher income people once kind of we get past phase 5 and into a new normal scenario, and that may result in a bounce back of consumer spending, you know, that may approximate a new normal. I suppose we don't know a lot about precautionary savings. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that. Kind of the only thing that we've been able to say, given that given the method that we use, is that these higher income households, because their spending is restricted, they may have extra savings when this is all over.
Okay, Conor, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I'll only add a small bit over what Karina has said. I think two things are quite interesting. In what we've done, we have made no adjustment to expenditure on fuel and light in the household, or housing costs, for example, the rents or mortgage payments. And particularly when you see the change in electricity prices, it's likely that would affect household bills as well as other things like or the oil price affecting motor bills. So certainly loosening that assumption of constant prices as we move through the year will be really interesting to see how not only volumes develop, which is kind of what we've done, but how values develop as well in terms of activity. So I think that's a really interesting step to take this piece forward. In terms of precautionary saving, you know, we haven't explicitly looked at that in this piece, but again, that is something that's really interesting.
Okay, let me throw one more question in, and I suppose maybe this is for Conor, but not necessarily. But it's a question of what the reaction should be. Okay, so you've identified a major hole developing in the public finances. Is there any sense that we need to chase this? Anything at all, or?
Okay, so let me give some broad reflections on this. Right, first of all, the path for consumption out to the end of the year is highly dependent on the degree to which the public health restrictions need to stay in place to maintain the virus in the community and elsewhere. So, in a sense, the ability of consumption to react or to recover really is dependent on how the epidemiological situation plays out over the next while. And I guess, you know, we're quantifying the fall in indirect taxes. You know, the absolute scale of the labour market adjustment and the difficulties that businesses are having means that, you know, all of the tax heads are going to be likely considerably lower than expectations. So the extent to which we can continually borrow at present to meet the gap will have to come into focus later in the year. Certainly, you know, the the supports to maintain incomes and to make sure households are cushioned from the blow are critically important now. But as the disease path is showing itself, we're going to have to make some hard decisions around that.
Okay, another question that has come in, again, interesting one, and it has a distributional dimension. So let me try and summarize it in the following way. We know that indirect taxes are broadly regressive. So is there a sense in which this tax fall can be interpreted in any way positively from a distributional perspective? Okay, I'm sure you get the sense of the question. Barra, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So just on the issue of indirect taxes and their regressivity or otherwise, so this gets into a bit of a tricky issue in, are you measuring these with respect to income or respect to consumption? Because the common view is that indirect taxes tend to be progressive because they take a higher share of, as they're larger as a percentage of income for low income households than for high income households. But what a lot of that is driven by is that there are many households at the bottom of the income distribution who spend more than they have an income. And often that's because they're experiencing, say, a temporary period of unemployment, or because it's a student who's drawing down savings. And so actually, if you look at indirect taxes as a percentage of consumption, the picture's a lot more flat. So and that's driven by two things. It's one that, you know, a lot of items that make up the baskets of those who are lower income households tend to be zero rated or reduced rated. And then just so main rated items make up a large portion of expenditure of higher income households. So that kind of evens out the pattern in terms of the regressivity. So it's not, I don't think it's quite true that indirect taxes are as regressive as is kind of made out. However, given that, you know, it kind of, what we're showing is that in one of the first graphs that Cathal presented there was that essentials make up a much larger proportion of the baskets of lower income households than others, and that's kind of, those essentials are going to be the things that really are going to carry on almost not no matter what happens, but they're going to be less likely to be hit by any of the falls to income, and they tend to be things that are reduced rated. So, you know, groceries tend have a lower rate of VAT applied than most other goods, most groceries. And so there is going to be an issue there, in that and that's one of the reasons why, that, as Cathal highlighted, that the indirect tax hit is so much greater than the consumption hit, is that the goods which we think are carrying on or expending is carrying on are those which are taxed less. And so that's going to be possibly an issue into the future. And in terms of I'm not sure about the distribution issues of that, but one thing that you do maybe get into is there's been some suggestions for reduced rates of indirect taxes to be applied to other goods where, you know, there's been difficulties experienced, and that kind of raised an issue of, well, one that only really benefits businesses where spending is taking place. So you might be boosting certain sectors, like say cafes who are still operating as takeaway, but you're not really doing anything by VAT cut in those areas for those businesses who can't operate. And so it's not a particularly well-targeted policy from that point of view if you want to help support businesses or spending, in that it requires the spending to be able to take place in the first instance. So I think there's distributional issues that are maybe not as severe as they're kind of often portrayed, but then there's also a whole set of issues about, well, are indirect taxes really the best policy tool to address some of the things that are being suggested at the moment?
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to take another question. Can the panel reflect on the following issue? This fall in indirect taxes would suggest that our reliance on corporation taxes has now increased in relative terms. Does that imply that our sort of overall tax structure is more vulnerable than ever before? It's a quite good chunky question. I don't know, will we throw that one at you, Conor?
Sure, let me take that one. Yeah, like I guess mechanically, if that is to adjust the way we were suggesting, even in the extreme scenarios, and corporation tax revenue stays up, the overall adjustment will, you know, it could be a case that actually corporation tax is a larger share of the take than is the VAT. I guess the vulnerabilities around the corporation tax rate don't go away in this scenario. It makes us even more reliant on the contributions of a small number of multinationals in terms of the tax take. So, you know, in the medium term, policies to try and address that are still going to be required going forward. And I think that kind of brings into stark reality the reliance, the concentration, the corporation tax receipts in that area. You know, the other question is, how are corporation tax receipts going to evolve with the current crisis? And that's not something we've obviously looked at in this paper, but it's, and there are difficulties in terms of the timing of tax payments and what accounting year they relate to, which may affect the path of those receipts. But in a sense, they're not going to be insulated completely to either from this global pandemic, even if some of the sectors like pharma or IT that we're reliant on, or that we have a heavy concentration on, do okay relative to others during the economic adjustment that occurs here. So I think more than ever, it just points out to us the challenges with the concentration in that, but how the two interact, I'm not sure at this point.
Okay, and we're coming towards the end now, but we will take one more question that has arisen, and we've touched on some of these issues, but it's been asked more directly. Does this mean that income taxes will have to rise? So who'd like to take that? Barra, you're a brave man. We'll let you take a run at that one.
Brave or foolish, I'm not sure. So I think income tax and USC together made up in last year about 40%, I think it was, of total taxes that were taken in. So they are very, very important taxes, and particularly given what Conor's been talking about, that you potentially we already were over reliant arguably on corporation tax. I think that's kind of taken as a given now. If VAT is going to be much reduced in years ahead because there's certain areas which are particularly tax rich which aren't going to recover, that does mean we're going to need to get tax revenue from somewhere. And it's very hard to do that by excluding what was 40% of tax revenues. Now, that's going to have taken a hit as well because that's dependent on employment. But as employment returns, it is going to get, it's a very, very important way of raising revenue. It's a very easy way to raise revenue. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that it's just concentrated in a certain group, either, at the bottom or the top. You can use income tax and USC to raise revenue from a broad chunk of people. So from that point of view, I think it's hard to think about if we need to raise revenues. It's hard to see how income tax doesn't play a role in that. What role in that is ultimately a question for politics, and where that distribution falls, again, ultimately a question for policymakers. But it does look like it's going to have to play some role.
Okay, very good. Anybody else want to come in before we close? No, very good. Okay, well, we've hit the 40-minute mark, so that's what we said we would try and aim for. So let me just thank Cathal for a wonderful presentation, our panelists for engaging with the questions, and our audience for participating and providing some very interesting and thought-provoking questions. So I think I've certainly enjoyed this again. I hope all the participants have as well. And once again, I think I've said this the last few times, maybe we'll be back in the ESRI building doing this in person at some point, but the longer time goes on, the more I think we'll be doing it this way. But anyway, I think it's working, and it's good to be connecting with people. So with that, I'll just close the event. So thank you very much.